The Department of Employment and Labour has published draft regulations for the Employment Equity Amendment Act for public comment. The new draft regulations were introduced in February in an effort to address the sectoral and numerical targets provided in the Amendment Act. Labour analyst Dr Dale McKinley joins us now for this conversation. Dr McKinley, good afternoon rather. What are the key amendments introduced by the Employment Equity Amendment Act, particularly regarding the establishment of sectoral numerical targets?
Yeah, so listen, I mean, this has been a fairly controversial process from the beginning when the Amendment Act was published a year ago or so. And these new regulations have been subject to a lot of different engagement and discussion over the last year. So there have been some changes. I think the key changes that we've seen from the regulations that have been put out about several months ago are that the designated groups that would be the targets, essentially, that are set for, are no longer divided according to specific racial categories in the context of Indian, colored, so-called colored, and black African. Now what we have is we have just a category called black, which includes all Indian, colored, and black African people and workers. And then the only other category that is designated is disabled. And then it's just divided according to gender, so female, male. And what it does is also, it basically allows a bit more flexibility in terms of how employers are to come to these targets. In other words, what's called the economically active populations. So basically what the regulations say is if you're a national organization or employer, you can use the national demographic, economically active population. If you're in a province, you use that provincial one. So it does, there have been some changes, but overall, if you look at the new targets, they're fairly similar to what was published about a year ago, and they're still going to remain controversial and potentially subject to some legal challenges.
Okay, so you speak about controversy, Dr. McKinley, and one area for me that I'd like to highlight as a layperson is blanketing all people of colour into one category, which is black. Now, in many conversations we've had with members of the coloured community in the Western Cape, for instance, the argument is that they have been overlooked in certain decisions or employment decisions, etc. Now, if everyone who is of colour is blanketed, surely it means that the potential of being overlooked is that much greater, is it not?
Well, it could be, but that's mitigated to some degree by the second point that I made just recently, which was about the economically active population in that particular province. So let's take the Western Cape. If we look at the demographics in the Western Cape, you would have the majority of the Western Cape population would be classified as colored, then you would have black African, then you would have white and so forth, down to probably the least amount would be those that are classified as Indian. So if you did that, and if you were your targets were based upon that demographic, then basically the proportional of colored folks that would be then targeted would be greater than those that would be black African or would be Indian. So there is, I mean, it gets a bit confusing if you think about it in terms of, and this is one of the criticisms is, if an employer is sitting there, and these are, by the way, only designated employers are over those who are over 50 employees. If you're sitting there and you've got thousands of employees, for example, let's say in correctional services where there have been some cases in the Western Cape around affirmative action and around these very things that you're talking about, you're talking about a situation where people are going to have to come up with some fairly sophisticated solutions and also basically targets that look over a 5-year period is what this legislation says. So I'm thinking to myself, and I think many others are thinking that while this is well-intentioned in some degree to try to create inclusivity and transformation, it could be a bureaucratic nightmare for employees.
Now, you've talked about controversy. Is the controversy just around the two issues that we've discussed, or are there other areas that you'd like to highlight?
Well, I think the one area is of course, and this is a debate among some of our population, which is that government shouldn't, as long as if it's state and if it's government employees and public employees, well, fair enough. But they shouldn't be legislating in the private sector whether or not, for example, if you look at the breakdown the levels of what are considered designated employees. There's top management, there's middle management, and then there's basically skilled technical. You have 3 or 4 different versions. And if you look at the percentages that are the targets in the actual regulations, you get a situation where, for example, the percentage of middle management is 92%. That should be black African, black people, which is that Indian colored and black African. And that, in the case of, would be, controversial in the sense of people think that's social engineering, or that's trying to basically cut out a large section of the other minority population. So there certainly would be, I think, some opposition and some controversy related to whether or not government is overstepping its bounds in this case. And the second controversy would be whether or not it's capable of implementing this legislation and enforcing it. What we have in our country are many pieces of legislation that some would disagree with, but some think are fairly good. But the ability of government to enforce them and to regulate them is not matching the intent. So I think that's the issue, is if you get a situation where your bureaucracy is not capable of enforcing, then what's going to happen in many cases is those within connections and those with political power are going to get away with things, while those that are smaller and who don't have that are going to be enforced, the legislation will be enforced. And we've seen that in our country, and that could cause a lot of controversy and conflict.
Now, what we are aware of is that this bill is now available for public comment over the next several weeks. Now, how likely is it that those that are most impacted by this proposed legislation will have the opportunity to comment?
Well, I think there's already been quite a lot of commentary. And I mean, one would imagine that's not surprising given the fact that we're talking here predominantly about private sector employers that are over 50 employees. So not small scale, you could say medium-sized enterprises as well. But I think where you're going to get the corporates, the big boys, they've got, entire divisions that are basically lawyers and PR people and HR people that are going to engage with this. I think who's going to get left out predominantly are the medium-sized and the smaller businesses, which don't have the capacity to basically make commentary or to make the research necessary to say, look, this is a problem for us. So that's the general problem with legislation oftentimes, is that those that are in the know, those that have that have presence in Parliament, that have connections with politicians, are the ones that get heard, and the small person gets left out. And I think that would be the concern here.
So obviously, if this is all adopted into law, there will be penalties for those that do not abide by the new law, so to speak. What are some of these penalties?
Well, I think the main penalty appears to be fines, which would again be, expected. I don't think I've looked at the legislation. I don't think there's any case where you would have a situation where you would charge someone with criminal intent. In other words, they would spend time in prison for not meeting the targets. But you certainly could get substantial fines. I think that would be the main punishment. And of course, the other punishment is if you don't meet the targets, you don't get any work with the government. That's the biggest one for many, many people, because a lot of work with government brings in a lot of income for many of these larger corporations in particular, and medium-scale ones. So those two things, fines and a basically blacklisting from government contracts, would be the two key things. Again, whether or not these get enforced, and this and whether or not they get enforced equally, I think would be a concern that we've seen in cases where people have violated labor legislation willy-nilly and get away with it simply because they're politically connected, or that they have lots of capital to spend and donate to political parties, or whatever the case might be. So this is going to have to be watched very carefully so it doesn't become something where, once again, it's an unequal enjoyment of the law or representation of the law in this case.
So when we look at transformation and addressing historical inequalities, is this bill likely to do that?
I think it'll go some way in doing so. But fundamentally, the transformation of our workforce it takes place at the base. In other words, where education, where people are basically getting the kinds of skills that the economy needs, that we need to be having in South Africa. And that's a problem. If you look at the mismatch oftentimes between what is needed within the economy and in the sectors and what is being produced within our educational system, there's a huge gap there. So I think it's not just about legislation that says, look, go for this target. That target might be a good target to adhere to if it's done properly. But fundamentally, transformation is going to take place at the grassroots level, at a social level, where our education and our social relations are going to become much, much more inclusive and integral to what we need as a country, as opposed to people seeking sort of narrow interests and basically trying to create a situation where they are not particularly interested in transforming the bottom of our society, but are simply interested in transforming the top. And that's the problem with a lot of black economic empowerment programs, is they've empowered a fairly small section of our population without transforming the base.
Now, finally, Dr. McKinley, before we let you go, these submissions come in at a time where we're a few weeks away from the general elections and possibly a new government that may view these very issues differently. How is that likely to impact the processes, do you think?
Well, once a piece of legislation is signed into law, it's law, irrespective of who comes into power after that. But it would make a difference in terms of the enforcement. And it could certainly make a difference in terms of how it's interpreted and how, basically how serious it's taken. If a new government, let's just say, for example, a DA coalition, were to take national power, the coalition that DAs put together, no doubt they would have a much more critical view of this kind of legislation, would want to sort of slow it down and not implement it nearly to the extent probably that an ANC or an ANC coalition government would. So it could have impact. And also what you could do, depending on the coalition politics and the smaller parties that were part of that coalition, you might get indications of where this legislation would be differentially implemented or with intensity in different provinces, depending upon who's in that coalition and what their demographic support is. So, for example, let's take Action SA or the Patriotic Alliance or whatever it might be. If they were there in that coalition, they could have an impact in how this legislation rolls itself out in particular provinces as well.
Good speaking to you, Dr. McKinley. Appreciate your time. Labour analyst Dale McKinley speaking to us about the Employment Equity Amendment Act, which is now up for public comment.